Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Last week, I posted my conversation with Shelly about missions, and after I had that conversation with her, I stumbled across the movie Believe Me on Amazon Prime and decided to give it a watch. It had been a film that I had, sort of been recommended several times, but never really had the chance to watch it. And so I decided after sort of having that conversation, let me give this a watch. And it brought up a lot of thoughts that I sort of started mulling over. So I kind of want to talk about it a little bit and sort of unpack the things that I got from that after, talking with Shelly too about missions and how that all works within church culture. Before I go too much into it, first, a couple disclaimers. If you're interested in this movie not being spoiled for you, I recommend you don't watch this. I'm going to try to not spoil as many things as possible, but I'm definitely going to be talking a little bit about the film and what happened. So you can watch it on Amazon Prime or whatever, but come back when you're ready. The second thing is that I am going to be talking a little bit about evangelical culture, because that's really what the movie is centered on. And I want to be cautious there, because although I grew up evangelical and called myself evangelical for a long time, I no longer sort of adopt those labels. And so I don't want this to come off as some sort of attack on evangelicalism. But I do think that there's value in, parsing apart, religions, even if they're not your own, and trying to kind of uncover the things underneath that. So I want to do that with evangelicalism, but I am going to try to walk lightly there, just because there's a lot of sensitivity, I think, with that, especially after sort of separating myself and walking away from it a little bit. So quickly, I'll give a brief summary of the movie for people who haven't watched it. Basically, a group of frat guys come together and, under the guise of a Christian missionary effort, decide to raise money to pay for college tuition. So they get recognized by this leader of this missions organization that wants to sponsor them, take them on tour, and help them raise money from different churches across the country. And so basically they decide to do it, embezzle all of this money. And the story focuses around the moral implications of what they're doing, and just the struggle of having to sort of adopt and blend into this world as they're, basically being wolves in sheep's clothing. If you're evangelical, this movie could definitely come off as offensive. Now, I believe the director is an evangelical Christian himself, so he probably did this as some sort of satire to kind of unpack sort of the tensions underneath evangelical culture. And like any good satire, it gets you to stop and look at yourself and realize maybe you need to do some auditing on the culture that you're living in. And I think sometimes in order to get to that place, you do have to be a little bit offended. So there is some things that I think could be sort of scandalous in this representation, or at least taken that way. I mean, overall, it was a fine movie. I think there was some oversimplification in the representation of those cultures, but I also think that a lot of that was in service to the plot and trying to, enhance that story and sort of heighten the problems so that they were more prominent. So I don't want to go too deep into sort of criticizing that. Rather, I'd sort of just want to address some of the things that they were criticizing and kind of unpack those to get to the core of some of the things that it was saying. Because I think for me that points to something a lot bigger outside of just this little bubble. So the first sort of umbrella of the criticism started with missions. So you've got these guys pretending to be missionaries, and they get this idea from some girl at a church who is going on a mission trip to Hawaii, and they ask her, oh, how much money have you raised? And she's like, oh, I've raised $20,000 in 2 weeks. And they go, oh, well, where's the accountability for that? And she's like, well, I'm going to have a video camera. And I think the point of that is to really say, where is the money going, and where is the accountability in that? And I think for a lot of missions organizations, that's not what it's actually like. I think there's a lot more accountability than portrayed there. But the point is that I think sometimes it's very easy for people to stand for a cause and raise a certain amount of money, and we add to that without really understanding where's the money going and how's it being utilized. And I think even on a bigger perspective, because this was just one little piece of the individual, but the movie also kind of looked at it in a bigger aspect as well, as you see this huge missions organization that's helping all of these missions raise money. There's a lot of this sort of frivolous spending that you see, where you've got big cocktail parties and huge green rooms and big auditoriums and a lot of things to make all the people sort of raising the money very comfortably. I think subtly the director was trying to kind of poke at that and say, okay, how well are we utilizing this money in certain ways? And I think there's something in missions that, it leaves a question there of, well, how do we really know how to use, make the dollar go as far? I think the second point, which is sort of related to that, is how is this actually helping people? How is the money that we're putting into these missions actually impacting the communities that they're helping? And there's probably varying degrees on, how to measure that depending on what you're raising money for. I think there's all types of missions throughout churches, whether it's just sort of an evangelical mission of trying to spread the gospel in a city, in a place, versus maybe something where you go and you build houses or build wells. And I think it just leaves a lot of questions of how are we using our money, and are we doing the best we can with it? And I think often in churches, there's not a lot of time to stop and think about that. I think a lot of times it's creating these narratives that sound really good, but never get deep down to the practical. I think there's a lot to be said about where the dollars are going, but I think there's also something to say about how are they actually being spent and how is it actually affecting communities? Because I think, like Shelley had talked about, there's often things that we think are the right things for communities but don't end up servicing. And I think there is some wisdom into stop and think about those things. I think the last point that they try to address is sort of why do people go and what is the motive for these missions? I think they try to really parse out and make it clear that there are some people who are going at this to be self-serving and end up designing missions that impact them more than maybe the communities that they're trying to help. And I don't even think they say that in like a malicious way. It just ends up sort of being that way as our human flaws sort of come into the system and start overtaking the thing that is supposed to be good. And then I think the other sort of half of that is there a certain system in place that sort of grooms people or leads them into these mission fields, and how do we know when that call is genuine? You see this one kid telling these frat guys that what they're doing has inspired them to go to Africa, and they start feeling, at least one of them starts feeling, this moral pull to say, I don't know if what I'm doing is right, and that I don't even believe what I'm saying, yet he's buying into that. Which I think kind of leads to the next sort of bigger umbrella of criticism, which is the church culture in general. So I think the first sort of criticism in the whole thing is, how do we engage authentically in a pursuit of faith without getting caught up in the hype? You have these group of people who are really good at being able to pick up the signals and the patterns and mimic the behaviors to make them seem dedicated and honest. And you see a lot of people getting caught up into those things. And in a lot of ways, it reduces it to something sort of simple. I think that sort of hype culture and getting caught up in the feelings of the experience that is being curated is something that's very easy to pick out in a lot of sects of evangelical culture. And I think the criticism in some ways is important to point out. How do you get outside of just the emotions and the well-designed services to elicit emotion and see through that and find a genuine faith? And I think branching off of that, that question comes, how do we weed out bad actors? You have all of these frat guys who are really good at being able to pick up the signals of what it is to be a good Christian, or, what is seen as holy in those circles, and mimic those things and blend into a system. And it starts asking the question, how do we weed that out, and how do we see it for what it is? Because it's very easy to put on a front and act something out. But I think, as the movie shows, with time, the fruits eventually show, and that can only go so far. But it is something to be aware of. And then I think the last sort of criticism they have on church culture is this idea of scandal, and how do we face that within a community? What ends up happening is these guys end up being caught. They find the bag of money and they get turned in, and instead of, reporting it to the police and calling it out for what it is, what eventually happens is that the leader of the missions organization decides to, instead of bringing the scandal to light, hiding it to protect the mission and the work they're doing, and take that money and put it into the bigger organization so as to not soil the idea of what it is. I think this is pretty common in church cultures, where we want to hide the gross parts, the dirty parts, the shadows that lie underneath some of these organizations in order to protect the mission or the faith of other people. To see that shift and the mask come off, I think for a lot of people could create a sort of crisis of faith and make them question their own beliefs. And that's a really scary thing. But I think some churches do try to avoid that, to be able to create something strong. But the question there is that really stronger, or is it, in that act itself, weakening the mission? And then I think the last sort of branch of criticism that I saw within it that I found really interesting, and it was much smaller than the rest, is sort of the idea of entertainment and how it affects the way that we participate in religion. And you see it most clearly with the music. We've got this music leader who really gets caught up in the hype and is really about the performance. And I think it starts to leave questions of, how can we use these mediums to create these systems that get people feeling, the Spirit, or feeling connected to God? And I think at the end of the day, it was sort of this acknowledgement of how some of those things can cloud sincerity in a religious context, and sometimes even manipulate. By putting up the music and flashing the lights and creating all these sensory experiences, it starts to make you believe in them a little bit more and connect a little bit more and become more compelling. And that in the wrong hands is very dangerous. The other sort of little criticism on entertainment they had was the Christian film industry. And I'm sure Christians and non-Christians alike have seen some Christian films, heard some Christian films, and I think there is a reputation that they're not very good. And as a filmmaker who has worked with other Christian filmmakers, there is this sort of sense of wanting to separate yourself from that and not be involved in that. And not to say that there isn't good films. There definitely are some well-made films. And I sometimes think about the criticism of Christian film and think it may be a little too severe, even though I tend to end up on the more critical side when it comes to those things. But I think because of the faith-based nature, it just sticks out more when you really look at Hollywood and the films that they produce. They produce a lot of really terrible films too, but they also produce a lot of very good films. And so I think it doesn't stick out in our head as much, but there's a lot of complications in the way that represents. But I think the biggest thing that they were sort of pointing out in the film is the way that some of those movies tend to oversimplify the ideas of what it is to be human, whether it's faith, forgiveness, or just sort of the way that they live their lives in general. And so I think it's a call to kind of create more depth and more sincerity and rawness within Christian filmmaking. And the director is a Christian himself, so I think this film as a whole is this attempt to try to do that. So what the movie didn't talk about, but I do think is really important to address, is how impactful entertainment, media, and information is in the way we think. There are all of these subtle messages that are being fed to us and that we're consuming, and they shape the way that we think. They change the patterns in our brain and begin to make us see the world in a different way. And the best filmmakers are the masters of subtlety. And I don't want to say manipulation, but maybe the better term is orchestration of emotions. What I think very good filmmakers are good at is being able to orchestrate a production to get the emotions that they desire. And that's a really powerful thing, especially because I think emotions often overrule some of our decisions generally, especially the ones that we haven't really taken the time to unpack and develop. And we have all of these signals coming from this media, and I that's processing in the background and we don't even notice it, but these embedded narratives, these signals within the making of the film that give us a sign of reliability or authority, and they slowly start to shape the way that we think. When it comes to religion, it can be a really important part of processing all of those things. So this film focuses on evangelical culture, and in a lot of ways that's a very easy target. But what I will say is that I think a lot of these criticisms can be taken and used against other religions and religious sects in Christianity as well. But they probably just manifest themselves in slightly different ways. So after watching the film, I definitely had a lot of questions, but when I started boiling it down and trying to figure out what were the main takeaways for me that sort of sparked questions, I came up with sort of 3 that encompass a lot of these other issues, which I know I probably did not cover well. I did not do justice to covering the way that they talked about that. So definitely apologies for that. But here are the 3 questions that I walked away with that I thought all of these criticisms were aimed at. I think the first is, how do we avoid letting the tribe dictate what we think and stop us from searching for religious answers genuinely? I think 2, how do we weed away the crap from the truth? in this film, it definitely focused on religious communities, but I think that that's a bigger question that can even be, taken outside of religious communities into more broader culture. And the third thing is, how do we move away from this mentality of doing things that make us feel good into pursuing things that are practically going to do good? And none of these questions have easy answers. So I'm not going to try to unpack all of this today. I don't think the time that it takes to answer those questions would do justice to try to throw this in at the end of this video. But what I do want to say is that going forward, those are some of the main questions I'm going to tackle, especially because those things were really driving a lot of my journey towards finding truth and trying to get to the bottom of, the big questions of the world, and led to a lot of my information addiction. So that's what I plan to do moving forward, sort of start unpacking those questions and figure out how we do that better. So with that, I'm going to close. So like always, I'm going to end with a serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.